Good evening, everybody. We're going to give you an overview on the birth certificate to try and clear up any misunderstandings you may have as to its legal, lawful status, or what it is, what it represents, what do we do with it, what do we don't do with it. And to do that, I'm going to give you a bit of a background, first of all, into some overviews, and then we'll get into the birth certificate itself. So the first thing that we're going to do is to understand what's the format of the world we live in. How do we get to this point of who the people who are controlling us and how are they controlling us? So the first thing I'm going to show you is a quick overview, if I can find it. Okay. Now, most of us, if we just think back, because all of this goes back to ancient Egypt, I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but back then, the green circle represents the pharaoh, the king. And the reason he was the king was because he was the blood lineage of the gods. Okay, so he was the all-powerful one. And so the blood lineage used to go through the women because you knew that somebody was born of a woman, but you didn't know necessarily who the father was. Now, the significance of that is every single president of the United States is related on their mother's side back to King James and to Charlemagne. So all of the presidents are all linked through the blood lineage of their mothers. Okay, this is very important. At that time, the priests of Amun were the administrators. The pharaoh was the ruler, but the priests were the ones who did things. Now, over time, this happened around about 1800 to 1600 BC, so I won't go too much in. But what happened was the priests wanted to have control. They wanted the power. So what they did was they broke free from the monarch, and they grew in their power base as younger pharaohs took over. So they increased their power, and eventually what they did was they brought the pharaoh inside their control. And I'm putting this. Sorry, got the right one. Not quite working. Okay, they brought the pharaoh within their circle. It's not coming in. There we go. So they reversed things. So whilst the pharaoh may have been seen to be the ruler, he was now in control by the priests. The priests were the power base. And that has not changed since that time. All of the monarchs are actually under the control of this group, which back in Egypt was the Amun priests. Now it's the Vatican. Okay. So the Vatican controls the monarchs of Europe and around the world, and all the leaders and all the governments and everything, because this power base infiltrated everything, and they've selected monarchs. And I can go into a lot of detail on that, but that just gives you an overview. So here we are. Now we've got the Vatican. So the Vatican was the most powerful entity. They owned everything. They owned land. They owned, you name what it was. Now what happened was there was a group of people who tried, including King Henry VIII, by the way, who tried to break away from the church. Right? They tried to break away from the church. Now, the church wasn't stupid, so they had to find a way to make this happen. Now, what they've done is led you to believe that the state is separate to the church. How did the state get created? It got created by power factions within the church, just like they did back in ancient Egypt. And what they did was exactly the same process. You keep hearing about how history repeats itself. Well, it does over and over again in the way that they do things. This is not, for some reason, let's go here. So whilst you think that the church is separate to the state and it's the state that controls everything, the state is actually, like we had before, inside. Mine's not wanting to come forward for some reason. I think you get the message anyway about what's going on here. For some reason, mine's not. There we go. So even though you don't see it, this is the organizational structure we have, because the Vatican controls everything. All of the states, all of the countries, all of these are fictions, and they were created under the illusion of the state being separate. And the church literally just sort of slipped into the background. So you thought they were separate, but in actual fact, they're not. All of our countries, all of our governments are all controlled here by the Vatican. All right, so that's the structure that we're under, and we're being deceived by that. The Vatican actually created Islam. The Vatican creates all of these other different religions as well. So, and I can go into that in another episode, but I just want to give you that overview to begin with. Now, here's what they know, and we should know this. Simply, he or she who creates owns. If you create a painting, you own the painting. If you create a piece of music, you create a piece of music. If you co-create another living being with somebody, the two of you own that property. It's your DNA, you have created it, you own your child. Your child is actually your property, okay, until such time as it becomes of age. So quite simply, he or she who creates owns. Now the simple rule of that is that the created cannot dictate to the creator.
Creation, isn't it?
Okay, can someone turn their mic off if they're talking, please? Thank you. So the created cannot dictate to the creator. Simple thing, your children cannot dictate to you because you created them. That's a simple law of how it goes on. But it goes from the top to bottom. Now, here's the hierarchy that we all need to know. Whatever you want to call it, God, Yahweh, Allah, the universal creator, creator of all that is, it created first and foremost your soul. Your soul is a separate thing to your physical body. Whether you believe in reincarnation or don't believe in reincarnation, most of us would agree that our body is something that is separate to our soul, and our soul exists inside of our body. So your soul comes into the body that's created by it, which means the universal creator has authority over your soul. Your soul has authority over your physical body, which is a vessel. And that'll become relevant because the Vatican always talks about vessels, and all of the legislations talk about vessels and chattels and things that can be owned. Now, your physical body, when it is born, is given an appellation, usually by the mother. So the minute the baby appears, we go, oh, there's Mary Jane. I'm going to call her Mary Jane. And we don't mention her surname or anything like that, because surnames are not part of who you are. If we go back to ancient England, if Mary Jane was born in the village and her father was a blacksmith, they wouldn't say, oh, there's Mary Jane blacksmith. They'd say that's Mary Jane. But if next door another girl was born who they called Mary Jane, and she was of the carpenter or whatever, they'd say, oh, Mary Jane, which one? Mary Jane blacksmith. Oh, Mary Jane Black. Yep. Mary Jane Carpenter. Oh, Mary Jane Carpenter. Yes. So it was a qualification. It wasn't an appellation. It's something that's been added on later on. So when you are named by your mother at birth, and this will become very relevant, she names you Mary Jane. Now, if you're taking notes on this, I would suggest if your mother and or father are still alive, you get them to make an affidavit as to your being born live. And I have copies of those, and we can share those with them. These become incredibly powerful because they are the only eyewitnesses to you being a living, born man or woman. Their testimony is prima facie evidence. Actually, the prima facie evidence is actually you, the living man or woman, but they are witnesses to that. So their affidavit has incredible power. I suggest if you haven't got an affidavit from your mother and or father, that you get them done as soon as possible, as well as your own affidavit, which we will get to down the track. Now, what this does, this establishes you here as a soul in a living body, given an appellation of Mary Jane. Okay, that's where you are. Now, all of the other people of the village, they all get together and they decide that they want to form a government to oversee the business arrangements. Now, when the government was first created, guess who started infiltrating it? The members from here, so that they could control it. Okay, if you look at all of our politicians, you will find the majority of them from our major parties are Freemasons. And the Freemasons are connected back through the Vatican and various other organizations. So our governments were being formed and infiltrated by people who had an agenda. Now, the legislation was supposed to be enacted to control the government, not the people. Okay, all legislation is only supposed to apply to the government, not to the people. But what they did, these people, is they started to infiltrate and create down here legislation as a way of trying to control the people. Now, they understood that legislation is not law. Legislation is not law. It's a presumption of law. And all legislation relates to persons, citizens, subjects. So if you're a subject of Queen Elizabeth, you're down here, you're at the bottom of the list. And the way that they did this was they had to create something, because their realm, their whole realm exists on paper. Okay, the Vatican, going back, created a thing called Lex Fori. I've got that down here for you. Lex Fori, the law of the forum. That's the Senate of ancient Rome. And what they did was they offered people a whole lot of privileges to be citizens of Rome. Now, what the people didn't understand was they already had a lot of these privileges, but a lot of the other things that they were being offered, sounded pretty nice, but to do that, they had to give up their status as a living man or woman. They had to become a citizen. And by doing that, they came under the government. And that's what the Lex Fori was. Okay, it's the law of the forum. It's a choice of law rules. So you've chosen to not live by the laws of God, but to live by the laws of the government. So you went from being here, only answerable to your creator, to the bottom of the list where you are totally at the mercy of everything else. Okay, that's what happened in the past, and they became very, very good at doing it. And the way of doing it was they would add in the surname. Surname means name on top of. It's not your appellation that we had up here. You now have a name. So anything that has your appellation in capital letters and or the use of a surname is a totally different entity that becomes a person, a subject, a citizen, and it takes you from here being above the government to below being under the control of the government. You've literally given up your rights. Now, one of the other things people talk about, human rights. A human is a shade of man. Now, the reason that they use this term human is the Vatican knows that the human form was genetically engineered. There was no evolution. There was no Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve is a mistelling of the story. And I'll go into that in another night when people want, but just understand the term human means monster, means sub-animal. So when people are talking about, I'm demanding my human rights, you are actually declaring yourself to be an animal with no rights. Okay, so we don't use the term human. So how did the Vatican then control this? There was no problems. They controlled everybody while they were citizens. But then in the 1215, I think it was, a little thing came along called the Magna Carta, which was an attempt by the barons in England to break away from the control of the Vatican and the land. Now, a lot of people talk about the importance of the Magna Carta. No, it was signed by King John with a knife to his throat. So it's not a legal document. In his negotiations with the Vatican, King John made a deal that if he didn't pay back the money that was owed to him, the Crown of England would forever go to the Vatican, all its heirs, all its successors, everything. Now, King John broke the bargain. So the Crown of England is owned by the Vatican. Queen Elizabeth is renting it. She's renting the title, and she gets a role as the CEO of the Crown Corporation, which is based in the City of London. She's the CEO of a building. Now that becomes relevant when people start talking about our constitution, which is a whole other issue. But we're going to get to the birth certificate. I'm just giving you some background framework to understand how and why certain things happen. Now, because of this Magna Carta issue, the Vatican rebutted it the first time round because they owned everything, and that would think was the end of it. But the barons brought it up again about 60, 70, 80 years later, and the Vatican became very clever, because what they did was they issued a thing called the Unum Sanctum. Pope Boniface VIII in November 1302. Now, there's lots of very exciting stuff going around this time, and I'm not going to go into it here, but in effect, this is what the Vatican did. They claimed every soul on the planet for the Vatican. Okay, they claimed every soul on the planet for the Vatican. Now, what that means is, under the simple rule of law, that he who does not deny admits, means if you have not rebutted the Unum Sanctum in writing, then your soul is owned by the Vatican. So it was very clever of them. So you're up here, the top of the list. They're down here, and they claimed your soul on the premise that if you didn't object to it, you agreed to it being below them. Pretty clever, okay? But all you have to do is rebut it in writing. And you can do that through the affidavit, which we're talking about later on. Okay, so that's what they've done in the past. And so how did they start to record all of this? They started recording this through the birth certificate. All right, so now we're going to get into the details of the birth certificate. Now, a lot of people say, oh, the birth certificate's an illegal document. It's not legal. It's not. Everything that they do is legal. Their entire world exists on paper. The living man or woman, think of the simple sayings that we've overlooked. Your word is your deed. In the living world of the man and woman, what we say is our deed. When you go into a contract with somebody, there's a meeting of the minds first. That is then documented down on paper, but the contract exists in the minds first. The document is a secondary thing. It's a secondary thing that drags it into their world. Now, we know about the fact that the Vatican is also known as the Holy See. That's S-E-E. Okay, and it works under maritime law. Admiralty law is a way that it works, because it can't have the law of the land. Because who owns the land? The person who created it. And who created the land? The universal creator, God, whatever. Whereas the sea is not a tangible thing, and so the Vatican claims ownership of the seas, and that everything they do exists on paper and is the realm of commerce and trade. If you have to go to the magistrate's court, they will not deal with the living man or woman because they can't. So they kick you out of the court, and that's where all the deceits start. So let's have a little think about the birth certificate and how it comes into being. I think I've got a copy of one here that I can bring up, and most of you have probably got to that. And I know some of you are asking about a live birth thing. That's a whole other issue. We'll get to those. So here's a copy of a birth certificate, and I'm going to tell you what's wrong about this to begin with. This up the top is what's called a glossa. It's capital letters. That's G-L-O-S-S-A. This is not English. You might be able to read it as English, but it is not English. It is what the Americans call sign language. So Victoria means nothing. And in fact, it is called Dog Latin, which is criminal, evil, and counterfeit. If we want to go further into it, Victoria is not a physical living thing. It is not a land. People say, but we live in the state of Victoria. No, the state of Victoria only exists on paper. The land that we are on is known as Terra Australis. That's the landmass we're on. It's Terra Australis. This name is a name that was created by governments. It's a fiction created by governments, and it only exists on paper. That's why it has borders, because borders exist on paper. The same with this. It reads as Australia. No, that's a glossa. It's Dog Latin. And this fiction exists on Norfolk Island. Again, it's not the landmass that we are on. Under that, we've got another glossa called Births, Deaths, Marriages, Registration Act. Now, an act is a pretense, is a put on. It's not a real thing. So all of these things are not real. Anything that's in capital letters is not real. It's a fiction. Anything that is in boxes comes under what is called the four-corner rule. And the four-corner rule states that anything that is within the four corners of the box is not part of the document. So everything here is not part of the document. This is part of the deception, but you think it is. Now, a child is not the live offspring. In their legislation, a child includes stillbirth. And one of the maxims of their laws is a thing called inclusio est alterius, something or other like that, which basically says it only includes what is said, nothing else. So when it says birth includes stillbirth, it means that a birth is a dead entity, not a living being. And I'll get into how they do that in a minute. And everything else here is created. They take the name, the appellations given by the mother to the born offspring. They tack on the surname and they create an entity. Okay, so everything in this box or any other document you get from them, if it's in a box, it's not part of the document. If it's in capital letters, it is criminal and it makes the whole document criminal. One of the things about this, you'll notice that the date of birth is different down here to the date when it's registered. So this fictitious entity was created on this date, not the date when the living being was born. This is why you'll often find on these documents, it says that this document cannot be used for identification. And they're absolutely true, because it doesn't identify you. It's a register of a trust account. All righty. So let's get into the whole trust account thing. How do they do it? The process is really simple. I don't know if you can you all see me? I'm not sure what's going on here. Should be able to see me. I'll put it on full screen. This is what they do. When the mother, and some of you will have born children, so you'll know this, the minute that the child appears and it crowns, the mother names it. Let's call her here. Here she is. Beautiful, my beautiful little girl, I'm going to call Mary Jane. Now, what happens immediately after the baby is born? Women, anyone want to guess? There is severance. The umbilical cord is cut. There is severance. It divides the one entity into two, because what does the mother have to do next? She has to birth the placenta. And what's done with the placenta? In most cases, the woman abandons it. What does the system do? The system claims it under Admiralty Maritime Law. It salvages it as abandoned, lost at sea. And because of that, it weighs it to prove that it exists, and then it names it. And this is how they create the fiction. They create the fiction by naming it with the surnaming, putting their label on it, and they create trust accounts to it. Now, the beauty of it is that when the baby is in the womb, it derives the benefit from the placenta. It benefits from the food, the oxygen supply. The beneficiary of the placenta is the living being. So what they do is they then create a trust account of your placenta. They give it a name and they create the benefactor, rightly so, as the living child that was attached to it. So everything they do is totally legal and understanding. From then on, the fraud starts, because that's when they start to convince you that you are dead because you're a citizen, you're a fiction. They consider you to be unimportant, and you then have to pay all of the debts of that trust account. They do double dipping, and they use these trust accounts. They make 3 of them with the different names. Ever notice how they use like Mrs. Smith? Or here she is, Mary Jane Smith. She only exists on paper. Her name's in capital letters. Or sometimes they'll just use her surname in capital letters. Sometimes they'll put the surname first with a comma and then put the other names after. They'll call her Smith, comma, Mary Jane. These are the 3 different trust accounts that they trade around the world. Now, the fraud comes in because they want to keep controlling you. They don't want you to know the truth. So to make more money, because remember, they're all about commerce and trade, even though those accounts are all being paid for, they get you to put your money into those accounts. Okay, so the thing is, the birth certificate is not you. The birth certificate is a record of the trust accounts they made concerning your placenta. Once you get your head around that pretty simple thing, and you understand that their whole world exists on paper, not what you say when you're in the witness box, it means nothing. The transcript becomes the evidence. So therefore, your power becomes in you separating yourself as Mary Jane, as opposed to Mary Jane Smith. And the only way you can do that is through the paperwork that you put into their system. And you always make them prove their claim. Okay, so I'm gonna stop this now. I'm gonna fire it up again, and we're gonna have some Q&As. But that gives you the overview of what the birth certificate is and the fraud that they produced. So I'll stop this up. We'll start again, and we'll get some Q&As happening.